Hi, we will talk about The Outsider, a fiction story written by H.P. Lovecraft. He wrote it in 1921, but only published it in 1926. Today, he is very famous for his Lovecraftian horror, inspiring almost all of the monsters in science fiction. However, Lovecraft didn't write to entertain. It was a form of expression for himself, and this one story is not only about terror, but deep down, a fraction of his life. When he was a kid, his father died, his mother went crazy due to financial crisis, and he lived with his grandpa, who had an incredible amount of books. And Lovecraft would read them, isolated by his overprotective mother. We see this and how profound it was, as he sets the tone with the highlighted words. The narrator is limited and omniscient in the third person, as he talks about some memories of his past and doesn't know what is further from his perception. This passage shows how he wishes to be included in the social group, and associates it with the sunlight. This sense of isolation is core, and the fact that he is the only main character in the story reinforces this. Also, the lack of a specific setting gives a sense of loss, and at the same time the environment is depressive, reinforcing the feeling of isolation. Until now, he was in the exposition phase of the plot, and now he moves to the complication, as he chooses to challenge the isolation and look for the sunny sky, a metaphor for escaping solitude. 2 years before he wrote the story, he started making friends after a long period of isolation. As he finds some sort of light, the moon being a reflection of the sunlight, represents how he escaped solitude in this period. The highlighted sentence expresses how the images of being socially accepted were nothing close to this friendship. Here, he finds himself on the ground level, which is confusing, for it means that he recognizes that leaving the solitude is not something above, but simply that he left the worst and found himself on the same level people should be. Some of his writing styles show here. The contrast between the light-hearted and heavily bad connotated words evokes the fear of the unknown. Here we find ourselves in a crisis. The reaction is unexpected. Later, we know that people were scared of him. He was unaccepted by the gay crowd he longed for. Even with all of those pejorative adjectives, it was still not enough to describe the creature's horror. A remarkable feature of his writing when he does describe indescribable horrors. This represents his introspection phase. He's shocked by knowing that creature is himself. Now there's a moment of climax, which is counterintuitive. Ironically, this is when the character understands everything after the shock. He tries to go back to the solitude in his mother's house. However, his mother dies a few months before he finished writing this story. A few months later, he admits that he was relieved that he was independent from his mother now that she's gone. Finally, we conclude that he accepts his self-image, frugal life, and little happiness. Without the context, this was a mummy story. This is how he concludes he is an outsider. Finally, the reader is provided with the subtle clarification. And with everything together, we know he was looking through a mirror. As a final thought, it seems that Lovecraft suffered a lot in his childhood and then developed a narcissistic personality. The lack of a self-image made him vulnerable to the image other people projected onto him, making him feel like an absolute monster, unfit for society, born from isolation in his life. Ultimately, Lovecraft accepts his peculiarities and realizes he is a monster, unfit for society.